Hello students, I hope you are all fine. Today I am going to ask you some fun questions. Have you seen this animal? Yes, you are correct. It's an ox. Have you seen this animal? Yes, you are correct. It's a rabbit. Have you seen this animal? Yes, you are correct. It's a frog. So students, today I am going to explain you a chapter. Chapter number 6, The Ox and the Frog. Once upon a time, there were two best friends, Mr. Frog and Mr. Ox. Mr. Frog wanted to be strong, big, and powerful like Mr. Ox. Students, you also want to be powerful like your superheroes, right? Like Superman, Spider-Man. The same way, Mr. Frog too wanted to be powerful and strong like Mr. Ox. He said, "My friend Mr. Ox, look at you, strong and big and powerful. I wish I was like you." Mr. Ox said, "Why, Mr. Frog? You may be small, but you are very smart. I can never catch a fly with my tongue the way you do." Students, here Mr. Ox tells Mr. Frog, even though he is small, he is very intelligent. Mr. Ox says he could never catch a fly with his tongue the way Mr. Frog does. Still, Mr. Frog is not satisfied. He wants to be strong and powerful just like Mr. Ox. Mr. Frog said, "That's nothing. I am sure you can squash a fly with your huge and heavy legs. How I wish I could be like you." Squash here means to press something so that it is damaged or change shape or become flat. Students, here Mr. Frog doesn't like himself because he is small and light. He wants his body to be huge, heavy, just like Mr. Ox. Just then, Mr. Rabbit passed by. He said, "Take a deep breath and hold it long enough. I'm sure you will become big and bloated." Students, here Mr. Rabbit advises Mr. Frog to take deep breath and hold it long enough so that he can become big and bloated just like a balloon. "That does not sound like a good idea, Mr. Rabbit," said Mr. Ox. "I want to try, please," begged Mr. Frog. Mr. Ox did not like Mr. Rabbit's idea, but Mr. Frog kept begging him. He wanted to try so that he could become huge and powerful just like Mr. Ox. Mr. Rabbit and Mr. Ox watched Mr. Frog as he took deep breath. Mr. Frog looked puffed up. Mr. Frog took deep breath. He started looking swollen, just like a balloon. "Maybe your plan is working," Mr. Rabbit said Mr. Ox. Mr. Frog seemed to look bigger now, but slowly he started turning blue. Mr. Ox said to Mr. Rabbit that his plan was working. As his friend, Mr. Frog seemed to look bigger now, but slowly he started turning blue. "Oh no! He is holding his breath too long. He is turning blue," cried Mr. Ox. Both Mr. Rabbit and Mr. Ox shouted at Mr. Frog, "Stop! Stop! Let your breath out or you will burst." Mr. Ox shouted at Mr. Frog to stop holding his breath as he was turning blue. Mr. Frog could not hold his breath anymore. He blew out and became small again. He was very tired. Mr. Rabbit and Mr. Ox shouted together to stop Mr. Frog. If he held his breath any longer, he might burst like a balloon. So, Mr. Frog was scared of getting burst. So he slowly let out his breath and became small again. "I'm sorry for this bad idea, Mr. Frog," said Mr. Rabbit. "You are lovely as you are." Mr. Rabbit said sorry for his bad idea. He told Mr. Frog that he was lovely and smart, stay the same as he was. "Yes, please do not change yourself into me," said Mr. Ox. "I may be big, but I am not half as nimble as you. Do stay as you are unique." Mr. Ox said to Mr. Frog not to change himself into Mr. Ox, as even though he was big and powerful, he was not as half nimble as Mr. Frog. Nimble here means fast and light in movement. Mr. Frog smiled at his friends. He realized his foolishness. He jumped away with them happily into the forest, glad to be alive and glad to be himself. Mr. Frog was happy at last as he realized his own stupidity and jumped away into the forest. He was glad to be alive and glad to be himself. So students, you should be happy and stay as you are. There is no need to become like someone. You are all unique and you are very talented, so be yourself. I hope you enjoyed the story, students. Thank you.